In the Star Wars film, The Empire Strikes Back, there's a brilliant scene where the crew of the Millennium Falcon are trying to escape from the forces of the Empire, and they go into an asteroid field and decide to land on this huge asteroid. And they find on this asteroid a cave, and they go down into this cave on the asteroid and land the craft inside the cave. And in there, they're safe from the forces of the Empire, which are marauding outside trying to find them. But after they've been in this cave for a little while, there are some strange things happening. There are some strange creatures in the cave and strange noises. And sometimes it almost seems that the ground beneath their feet moves. And Han Solo seems to have caught on possibly to what's going on, and to test the theory, he rather rashly fires his laser gun into the ground beneath their feet. And as soon as he does so, the ground itself starts to move dramatically. And they stagger back into their craft, fire up the engines and instantly take off and head out of this cave. And as they come towards the entrance of the cave, these teeth start to close together. They're actually inside the stomach of a huge creature. And just as they get close to closing, they manage to slip through the gap and make their escape. And I think for many people, the year 2020 has been a little bit like that. We thought that we were safe and secure. We thought that life in the 21st century, sophisticated modern life, was free of the kind of worries of past times. But actually, 2020 has thrown at us a year of instability and fear. The pandemic has come along, and we've come to feel that life is not as stable and secure as perhaps we thought it was. The kind of thing that we thought was confined to the history books has come to visit us. And that's left many of us feeling fearful, facing perhaps mortality in a way that we hadn't before, fearing for our families, for loved ones who perhaps are more vulnerable. And it leaves us asking the question, what kind of foundation is our life built on? Now, Jesus Christ is the central bright figure of the Bible. And of course, it's Jesus Christ who's the centre of the Christmas story, the baby in the manger. But when that baby grew up and Jesus was a man, on one occasion he told a story. It was a story of two builders, two men building a house, each building their own house. And one of them built a house on a foundation of rock. The other, building at the same time, built his house on the foundation of sand. They both complete their house, and then a storm comes along, and the storm hits, the storm rages, and the house built on the rock stands firm, but the house built on the sand falls flat. Now, Jesus told that story, and then he said at the end these remarkable words. He said to the people listening to him, if you want to build your house on a firm foundation, if you want to build your life on a firm foundation, you need to listen to my words and build your life on me. It's quite a remarkable claim, and a claim that surely needs to be tested. And if you were to look at Jesus' life, certainly a sort of cursory glance would seem to suggest that Jesus is no more able to provide a firm foundation than anybody else. He himself seems to be subject to the same kind of fragility, the same vulnerabilities that we are. We see him at Christmas, of course, as a baby, but a baby born into very fragile circumstances. His parents are quite clearly poor. They also seem rather caught out by circumstances, unable to provide in the way that you might hope for the birth of their first child. And when a threat comes from a king, they have to run. They become refugees and take their new baby to a foreign land in order to escape from a king who wants him dead. They don't seem to be any more secure, and the baby seems no more secure than the rest of us. And when you come to the end of Jesus' life, that impression is only strengthened. There we see Jesus finally in the grip of those who have sought to undo him, and they vent their best at him. He's taken to a cross, an instrument of torture and execution, and his life is taken from him. Finally, he's defeated. And those who were opposed to him at the time, they mock him, they laugh at him and say, "You who saved others, why can't you save yourself? You're not as secure as you thought you were, are you?" they're saying. So on the surface of it, at least, Jesus appears to be as fragile as the rest of us. But that is just the surface. If we look a bit deeper, we start to see a different picture. Because why is it that we are fragile? Why is our life, why is human life seemingly lived on a precipice, on a knife edge? Why is it we seem to live our lives, in one sense, hoping to avert all sorts of calamities and get through somehow to the other end? And even when we do get through life and get through a good number of years, all that awaits any of us is the sadness of the loss of life and the loss of loved ones around us. Why is life like that? Why is life so fragile? We might say, well, that's just the way it is. That's just the way the world is. But the Bible tells us a different story. The Bible tells us that fragility, that vulnerability, is not just the way it is, but it's actually the consequence of us wanting to live our lives without God. We don't want the God who made us interfering in our lives. We don't want to bother with him or listen to what he says to live his way. We'd rather just go our own way. I think that all of us can sense some of that in our hearts. Even if we want to follow God, there are times where we think, actually, I'd rather God wasn't interfering in my life. We sense that feeling, that desire to distance ourselves. And the Bible tells us that the vulnerability and the weakness of life is not just an accident. It's the consequence of that attitude we have towards God. It's the right consequence of shutting ourselves off from the God who made us. And when we look deeper at Jesus, we see there too that there's another story to tell. That actually Jesus is very different. Of course, the angels announce that he's different. They tell us that he is not like the rest of us, that he has been sent. That actually we discover he is God himself. He is the Son of God made man. And that when Jesus lived in this world, unlike us, he didn't shut God out. But in fact, he did the very best he could and always perfectly obeyed his Father, even when it cost him dearly, even when it hurt. Unlike us, he never shut God out of the picture, but always did everything he could to obey and live God's way. So why is it that Jesus suffers a fragile, weak life just like ours? Why does he look just the same? And the reason for it is that Jesus lived a life like ours, not because he deserved it, but because he was carrying in himself what we deserve. He was taking upon himself the weakness and the fragility of life that is the consequence of our wrong towards God. But he was carrying it for us. He was taking it upon himself. There have been stories over this time of COVID, back in April particularly, where it was at its worst. There were stories of nurses and doctors who could quite easily, for their own sakes, have stayed at home, but of course they were there caring for those with COVID, exposing themselves to the disease. Not only did they catch it, some of them, but some of them experienced the disease far more worse than they would otherwise have done, because they had been exposed to it from those that they were caring for. They didn't need to have experienced that for their own sakes, but they did, because in a way they were carrying it for the sake of others. That's not a perfect illustration of what Jesus did, but perhaps it gets us some of the way. In Jesus, it is far deeper. He actually took upon himself the consequences of our wrong towards God and carried it and paid our debt on our behalf. And what is more, after Jesus had died, those who were closest to him, terrified though they were initially, suddenly become emboldened and start to tell a story, start to testify to what they've seen. And they testify to the fact that Jesus had not stayed dead, but had risen back to life again, that in power he had triumphed over death and had shown himself to be greater, more powerful, different in every way, and capable of being our firm foundation, capable of carrying it all for us and providing for us the basis for life. And the challenge of 2020 is this. The challenge of 2020 is to not miss the opportunity that it presents us. Because in 2020, we've caught a glimpse of something that otherwise we wouldn't have seen. We've caught a glimpse of our fragility, our vulnerability. It's an opportunity for us to consider, what are we building our lives on? And is what we are building our lives on adequate for the task? Is it a firm foundation? Or actually are we building our lives on sand? Some years ago, as a family, we went on holiday to Zakynthos, and we needed a hire car while we were there. And I spoke to my sister who'd been to Zakynthos before about this, and she said, "Oh, we've got a contact, and he'll get you a good deal. You know, they do hire cars for cheap price." And I took my sister's word for it and booked the car at a pretty good price, and thought nothing more of it until we were walking out of the terminal building in Zakynthos towards the car park, following the Greek man who was showing us to the car, and became concerned that the car we were walking towards was not quite up to the same standard as the rest of the cars in the car park. In fact, it was a bit of a wreck. It had dents and scratches, and as you drove it along the many potholed roads of Zakynthos, it clunked and scraped in various ways. And on one occasion during the holiday, because we stuck with it, on one occasion in the holiday, my wife, who was sat next to me in the passenger seat, looked across and said, "What's that orange light on the dashboard?" And I said, "What orange light on the dashboard? There is no orange light." And she said, "Yes, there is." And on closer inspection, it turned out that the engine light was on, the warning light that tells you there's a problem with the car. And the reason I couldn't see it was because the hire car company had put a little bit of black tape on the perspex of the dashboard in such a place that the driver's view, you couldn't see it. It hid the orange light, but looking from the side, as it were underneath, my wife could see the orange light. And I think in a way, 2020 is the moment where the little bit of tape has been peeled back, where we've started to see that our lives are not as secure as we might think, that we are more vulnerable, that actually the things we build our lives on are very often not what we hope them to be. And we need something more than that. We need something other than that, something more secure, something that will give us peace and security, not just for this life, but for beyond this life, for the moment when we will all meet our Maker and our God. And at Christmas, the message of Christmas is that the baby in the manger, who looks so vulnerable, who looks so weak, is actually that rock, that stability. He is the one who has come to give us something to build our lives on, something which will give us a peace and a security, whatever the coming years throw at us, whatever is in store in 2021 or 2022 or 2041 and 42, whatever it might be. Whatever those years throw at us, even if it's the worst thing, even if it's the very worst thing that can happen, Jesus provides a foundation that will bring us through it, that sorts us out, not just in this life, but when we stand before our God, that pays our debt, that forgives our wrong, and enables us to be at peace, not only in this world, but with the God who made us. So this Christmas, let's look and find the stability that is found and offered in Jesus Christ.